In 1992, truck drivers Frank and Helen Jenkins vanished without a trace, leaving behind their 7-year-old daughter Clara and a mystery that would haunt her for 20 years. Everyone believed her parents had abandoned their family to start a new life. But when construction workers drain an old quarry in 2012, they make a chilling discovery that changes everything. The couple's truck emerges from the murky depths, perfectly preserved, with their skeletal remains still buckled in their seats. What Clara thought was abandonment was actually murder. Now a successful lawyer, she must confront the painful truth about her past and uncover a web of corruption that reaches the highest levels of power. Some secrets are buried so deep, they take decades to surface. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The autumn morning of October 15, 1992, began like countless others in the Jenkins household. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of Helen's homemade pancakes as golden sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains of their modest 2-story home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Frank Jenkins stood at the window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the maple trees in their backyard shed their crimson and amber leaves onto the frost-kissed grass. At 43, Frank carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had built something from nothing, his calloused palms and sun-weathered face telling the story of 2 decades on America's highways. Helen moved gracefully through their small kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she always wore before long hauls. At 39, she possessed the kind of gentle strength that had anchored their marriage through 15 years of uncertainty and triumph. The small gold cross at her throat caught the morning light as she flipped pancakes with practiced ease, humming an old hymn under her breath. Their daughter Clara sat at the scratched wooden table, her 7-year-old legs swinging beneath her chair as she pushed syrup-soaked bites around her plate, her mind already dreading the goodbye that loomed ahead. The Peterbilt 379 stretched across their gravel driveway like a sleeping giant, its midnight blue cab gleaming with the pride Frank took in maintaining every bolt and rivet. Chrome bumpers reflected the morning sun, and the carefully painted lettering on the doors read, "Jenkins Family Transport," in bold white script that Helen had designed herself. This truck was more than machinery. It was their livelihood, their office, their temporary home during weeks-long journeys across the continental United States. The sleeper cab behind the driver's compartment held their personal belongings, spare clothes folded with military precision, Helen's small collection of romance novels, and Frank's worn leather journal where he recorded every mile, every fuel stop, every thought that crossed his mind during the lonely stretches of highway. Frank checked his watch, a simple Timex that had survived countless road trips, its silver band worn smooth by years of wear. 8:15. They needed to be rolling by 9 to make their delivery schedule in Salt Lake City. The cargo manifest lay spread across the kitchen counter, detailing the shipment of agricultural equipment bound for Utah farms preparing for spring planting. It was honest work, the kind that let Frank sleep soundly at night, knowing he had earned every dollar through sweat and dedication, rather than cutting corners or compromising his principles. Clara's bottom lip began to tremble as she watched her father load the last of their supplies into the truck. Helen knelt beside her daughter's chair, her own heart heavy with the familiar ache of leaving. She pressed her lips to Clara's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of her child's strawberry shampoo. The little girl's arms wrapped around her mother's neck with desperate intensity, as if she could somehow prevent this departure through sheer force of love. Frank appeared in the doorway, his expression soft with understanding. He had grown up with a father who worked construction, disappearing for weeks at a time, and he knew the particular loneliness that settled into a child's bones when parents became strangers who lived in postcards and telephone calls. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and lifted Clara into his arms, feeling her small body shake with suppressed sobs. The goodbye ritual never became easier, no matter how many times they repeated it. Helen's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she promised Clara they would call every night at 8 o'clock sharp, their voices crackling across whatever distance separated them. Frank tucked a crisp $5 bill into Clara's hand, telling her to buy something special while they were gone. Maybe that book about horses she had been eyeing at the local bookstore. At exactly 9:07 in the morning, the Peterbilt's diesel engine rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the ground beneath Clara's feet as she stood in the doorway with her grandmother. Frank's mother, who had driven over to stay with the child during their absence. The truck pulled away from the house with deliberate slowness, Helen's hand visible through the passenger window, waving until the vehicle disappeared around the corner where Maple Street met Highway 27. The first 3 days passed without incident. Clara received her promised phone calls, her parents' voices warm and familiar as they described the changing landscape outside their windshield. Frank mentioned the spectacular sunset they had witnessed over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that reminded him of Helen's favorite dress. Helen talked about the truck stop diner in Denver where they had enjoyed the best apple pie she had ever tasted, promising to try to recreate the recipe when they returned home. The fourth night, the phone remained silent. Clara sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, staring at the telephone on her nightstand, as if her concentrated attention could somehow make it ring. 8 o'clock came and went. 8:15, 8:30. Her grandmother made excuses, suggesting that her parents might have encountered bad weather or mechanical troubles that prevented them from reaching a phone. But the knot of anxiety in Clara's stomach grew tighter with each passing minute, a cold certainty settling over her young heart that something fundamental had shifted in her world. By the 7th day, the local police had been contacted. Officer Martinez, a patient man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, sat in their living room, asking Clara's grandmother about the Jenkins family's habits, their route, their business contacts. He assured her that missing persons cases involving truck drivers were rarely cause for serious concern. Mechanical breakdowns, weather delays, paperwork complications at way stations could all explain temporary disappearances. The highway was vast, and communication technology in 1992 was still limited in many rural areas. Weeks stretched into months. The initial police investigation revealed that Frank and Helen had last been seen at a truck stop outside Grand Junction, Colorado, on October 18th. The security footage showed them purchasing fuel and supplies, Helen selecting a bag of Clara's favorite candy from the vending machine. They appeared relaxed, unhurried, unaware that they were living their final hours of normalcy. After that confirmed sighting, they had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed their 18-wheeler whole. The official conclusion, delivered with bureaucratic certainty 6 months later, stung Clara like a physical blow. Detective Harrison, a thin man with tired eyes and coffee-stained shirts, informed the family that Frank and Helen Jenkins had most likely abandoned their old life to start fresh somewhere else. Financial records showed modest debt, nothing catastrophic, but perhaps enough to motivate a desperate escape. The truck had never been reported stolen, had never surfaced at any impound lot or auction house. The simplest explanation, Harrison insisted, was often the correct one. Clara's world crumbled into sharp fragments of betrayal and abandonment. Her 7-year-old mind struggled to comprehend how the parents who had kissed her goodbye, who had promised nightly phone calls, who had hidden $5 bills in her school lunchbox as surprise treats, could simply choose to walk away from her existence. The golden memories of Saturday morning pancakes and bedtime stories became poisoned by the bitter knowledge that none of it had been real enough to keep them from leaving. 20 years crawled past like wounded animals, each anniversary of their disappearance reopening Clara's emotional wounds with fresh intensity. She channeled her pain into academic achievement, graduating valedictorian from high school, earning her law degree with honors, building a career as a criminal defense attorney with a reputation for relentless preparation and uncompromising integrity. But success could not fill the hollow space where her parents' love should have resided. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late September 2012. Clara sat in her downtown office, reviewing case files for an upcoming trial, when Detective Sarah Chen from the Grand Junction Police Department delivered the news that would shatter every assumption Clara had constructed about her life. Construction crews draining the old Riverside quarry had discovered something extraordinary, preserved beneath 20 feet of murky water that had kept oxygen and decomposition at bay for 2 decades. The Peterbilt emerged from its liquid tomb like a metallic whale, water cascading from its windows as the crane lifted it onto the quarry's muddy bank. Algae and sediment coated every surface, but the truck's essential structure remained intact, a time capsule from 1992. Inside the cab, still buckled into their seats as if they had simply pulled over for a brief rest, sat the skeletal remains of Frank and Helen Jenkins. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed what Detective Chen's voice had barely been able to convey over the telephone. These were not the bones of people who had driven into the quarry accidentally. who had swerved to avoid a deer or fallen asleep at the wheel during the long nighttime hours. The back of Frank's skull showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma. Helen's ribcage bore the distinctive marks of a sharp blade, wounds that would have been fatal within minutes. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the phone, her carefully constructed narrative about her parents' betrayal collapsing into dust around her feet. Frank and Helen Jenkins had not abandoned their daughter. They had not chosen freedom over responsibility, had not traded their child's love for the promise of a fresh start in some distant city. They had been murdered, and their bodies hidden in a place where no one would think to look for 20 long years. The truth hit Clara like a physical force, driving the breath from her lungs and sending her world spinning off its axis once again. Her parents had not betrayed her. They had loved her. They had died trying to return to her, and she had spent 2 decades hating them for an abandonment that had never occurred. Clara Jenkins sat motionless in her leather office chair, staring at the rain streaks racing down the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown law firm. The city blurred into impressionist smears of gray and amber through the water-distorted glass, matching the chaos swirling inside her mind. 3 days had passed since Detective Chen's phone call. 3 sleepless nights where Clara had paced the hardwood floors of her apartment, her bare feet making soft whispers against the cold planks as she wrestled with information that threatened to demolish the foundational beliefs she had constructed about her existence. Her coffee had grown cold hours ago, a bitter film forming across the surface in her favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny painted violets that her assistant had given her last Christmas. The case files spread across her mahogany desk remained untouched, their urgent deadlines now seeming trivial compared to the earthquake that had split her world in half. Clara's fingers traced the edges of a photograph she had retrieved from her apartment safe. A faded snapshot of her parents taken during happier times, their arms wrapped around each other beside their pristine Peterbilt, their faces radiating the quiet pride of people who had built something meaningful together. The knock on her office door came at precisely 11:15 in the morning, sharp and authoritative. Clara's secretary had left for an early lunch, leaving the law firm's reception area empty, except for the soft jazz music playing from hidden speakers and the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Clara rose from her chair with mechanical precision, her movements stiff from hours of immobility, and crossed the burgundy carpet to unlock the door she had kept sealed against the outside world for the past 3 days. Detective Arthur Hayes filled the doorway like a monument to persistence, his presence commanding attention despite his modest height and unassuming appearance. At 64 years old, Hayes carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had seen humanity at its worst, but refused to let that knowledge crush his essential optimism. His silver hair was combed with mathematical precision, and his navy blue suit, though clearly off the rack and showing signs of wear at the elbows, was pressed with military sharpness. Deep lines etched the corners of his pale blue eyes, each wrinkle a testament to decades spent squinting at crime scenes and studying evidence that most people would prefer to forget. Clara recognized him immediately, despite the 20 years that had passed since their first meeting. He had been younger then, his hair still retaining traces of its original brown color, but his eyes had held the same steady compassion that now observed her with patient understanding. During those terrible weeks following her parents' disappearance, Hayes had been the only police officer who had treated 7-year-old Clara like a human being rather than an inconvenient witness. He had knelt to her eye level during interviews, had brought her small gifts like coloring books and packages of animal crackers, had never made her feel like her questions were stupid or her fears unreasonable. Hayes stepped into Clara's office with the careful movements of a man who understood that he was entering sacred space, territory where grief had been carefully contained and managed for 2 decades. His weathered hands held a manila folder thick with documents, photographs, and evidence bags that represented 20 years of archived information suddenly thrust back into the harsh light of active investigation. The folder's edges were worn soft from handling, and Clara could see that someone had recently added new materials, fresh reports, and analysis that would forever change the narrative she had constructed about her parents' fate. The detective settled into the leather chair opposite Clara's desk, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He understood that rushing would accomplish nothing except to increase Clara's already overwhelming sense of disorientation. Hayes had spent 4 decades in law enforcement, long enough to recognize the particular species of shock that accompanied the sudden revision of fundamental beliefs. Clara was experiencing a form of emotional whiplash, her psyche struggling to reconcile 20 years of carefully managed anger and abandonment with the stark reality that her parents had been victims rather than perpetrators of betrayal. Hayes opened the folder with reverent care, as if he were handling religious artifacts rather than police evidence. The first photograph he placed on Clara's desk showed the Peterbilt as it had emerged from the quarry, water streaming from its windows like mechanical tears, algae and sediment coating every surface in shades of green and brown that spoke of long years hidden beneath the surface. The truck looked smaller somehow, diminished by its time underwater, but Clara could still make out the faded lettering on the doors that had once proudly proclaimed Jenkins Family Transport to the world. The second photograph made Clara's breath catch in her throat like a physical obstruction. Frank and Helen Jenkins, reduced to their essential elements, sat buckled into their seats with the dignified posture of people who had faced death with courage, rather than cowering in terror. Helen's skeleton was positioned slightly toward Frank's, as if she had turned to comfort him or seek comfort from him during their final moments. Even in death, separated by 20 years from the flesh that had defined their earthly existence, they maintained the connection that had sustained their marriage through 15 years of partnership and parenthood. Hayes withdrew a small plastic evidence bag from the folder, holding it up to catch the fluorescent light streaming from Clara's office fixtures. Inside the transparent container, a small piece of metal gleamed with dull malevolence, its surface pitted and corroded by 2 decades of submersion, but still recognizable for what it represented. The bullet had been extracted from Frank's skull during the autopsy, a .22 caliber round that had entered behind his left ear and lodged in the frontal lobe of his brain. The trajectory indicated that the shot had been fired from close range, suggesting that Frank had known his killer, had perhaps been standing in conversation when the trigger was pulled. Clara's hands began to tremble as she stared at the evidence bag, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light. For 20 years, she had nurtured her anger like a flame, feeding it with memories of abandonment and betrayal, using her resentment as fuel for the academic and professional achievements that had defined her adult life. The possibility that her parents had loved her, had died trying to return to her, had never chosen to abandon her, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow that left her gasping for breath. Hayes reached across the desk and gently retrieved the evidence bag, returning it to the folder with the same careful reverence he had shown throughout the presentation. His pale blue eyes observed Clara with the patient understanding of a man who had delivered similar news to countless families over the decades, who understood that grief was not a linear process, but rather a chaotic storm that could knock a person off their feet without warning. The ballistics report lay open between them, its technical language translating the violence of Frank and Helen's final moments into cold scientific terminology. The medical examiner had determined that Helen's death had been caused by a single stab wound to the heart, the blade penetrating between her ribs with surgical precision that suggested either medical knowledge or extensive experience with edged weapons. She had died almost instantly, her heart stopping within seconds of the attack. Frank's death had been equally swift, the bullet-destroying brain tissue essential for consciousness and motor function, ensuring that neither parent had suffered prolonged agony during their final moments. Hayes turned to a fresh section of the folder, revealing a collection of business documents that painted a picture of the Jenkins Family Transport Company as it had existed in 1992. Financial records showed a modest but stable operation, with regular clients who relied on Frank and Helen's reputation for honest dealing and reliable service. The company's books were meticulously maintained, every expense and receipt documented with the kind of attention to detail that suggested people who took pride in their work and understood the value of transparency. But Hayes had also uncovered information that cast new shadows across the Jenkins family's final months. Bank statements revealed a series of large cash deposits that had no corresponding explanation in the company's official records, amounts that were significant enough to represent either extraordinary profits or payments for services that Frank and Helen had chosen not to document through normal business channels. The deposits had begun appearing 6 months before their disappearance, growing larger and more frequent as the weeks progressed, suggesting that whatever arrangement had generated this additional income had been escalating towards some kind of resolution. The detective's investigation had led him inevitably to Robert Walsh, Frank's former business partner, and the man who had inherited control of Jenkins Family Transport following the couple's disappearance. Walsh had been 38 years old in 1992, ambitious and impatient with what he perceived as Frank's overly cautious approach to business expansion. Hayes had interviewed Walsh extensively during the original investigation, finding him cooperative but oddly unemotional about his partner's disappearance, more concerned with the practical implications for their shared business than with the human tragedy of a missing family. In the 20 years since Frank and Helen's disappearance, Walsh had transformed Jenkins Family Transport into Walsh Logistics, a regional powerhouse with a fleet of over 200 trucks and distribution centers scattered across 7 states. His personal wealth had grown exponentially, allowing him to purchase a mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, send his children to private schools, and maintain a lifestyle that seemed far removed from the modest circumstances he had shared with Frank Jenkins during their partnership. Hayes had spent the past week conducting surveillance on Walsh's current operations, documenting the steady stream of unmarked cargo that moved through his distribution centers during the overnight hours when legitimate businesses typically remained closed. The detective's trained eye had noted the expensive security systems protecting Walsh's facilities, the carefully screened personnel who handled sensitive shipments, and the cash-only transactions that occurred with suspicious frequency in businesses that should have operated primarily through conventional banking channels. Clara felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the same mental clarity that had made her such a formidable attorney during cross-examinations and closing arguments. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern, a narrative that explained not only her parents' murder, but also the prosperity that had followed in its wake. Walsh had not simply inherited a struggling transportation company. He had eliminated the moral obstacles that had prevented that company from accepting certain types of highly profitable cargo. The rain continued its steady percussion against Clara's office windows, each droplet contributing to the symphony of revelation that was reshaping her understanding of the past. She realized that her parents had not abandoned her out of weakness or selfishness. They had died because of their strength, because of their refusal to compromise the principles that had guided their lives and their business. Frank and Helen Jenkins had been murdered because they possessed something that their killer could not tolerate: integrity that could not be purchased, loyalty that could not be corrupted, and love that could not be abandoned even in the face of death itself. The Walsh Logistics headquarters rose from the industrial district like a monument to ambition realized, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the morning sun in patterns that hurt Clara's eyes as she and Detective Hayes approached the main entrance. The building stood 12 stories tall, a dramatic departure from the modest single-story office that had housed Jenkins Family Transport 2 decades earlier. Bronze lettering across the entrance proclaimed the company's success in letters 3 feet high, each character precisely positioned to project an image of corporate dominance and unshakable prosperity. Clara's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the lobby as she followed Hayes toward the reception desk, where a young woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile directed them toward the executive elevators. The ascent to the 11th floor felt interminable, each floor number illuminating and fading as they rose through the heart of an empire built on the foundation of her parents' graves. Clara's reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman struggling to maintain professional composure, while volcanic emotions churned beneath her carefully applied facade. Robert Walsh's corner office occupied prime real estate with panoramic views of the city skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows offering glimpses of the interstate highway system where his fleet of trucks moved cargo across the continental United States. At 58, Walsh had grown thick around the middle, his success manifesting in expensive suits that strained across his expanding waistline and custom-made shoes that gleamed with the kind of polish that required professional attention. His silver hair was styled with mathematical precision, and his smile revealed teeth so perfectly white they could only have been the product of extensive cosmetic dentistry. Walsh rose from behind his mahogany desk with theatrical enthusiasm, his arms spread wide in a gesture of welcome that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. His office was decorated with photographs documenting his rise from humble truck driver to logistics magnate. Images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and charity events where he posed with local politicians and business leaders. A crystal decanter filled with amber liquid sat on a sidebar, surrounded by matching glasses that had never known the touch of ordinary liquor. And Persian rugs covered portions of the hardwood floor with intricate patterns that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. The handshake Walsh offered Clara lasted several seconds longer than courtesy required, his soft palm pressing against hers with the kind of lingering contact that made her skin crawl. His pale blue eyes, so different from Detective Hayes's compassionate gaze, held a calculating quality that suggested he was mentally cataloging every detail of her appearance and demeanor for future reference. When he spoke, his voice carried traces of the working-class accent he had never completely eliminated, though he had clearly invested considerable effort in polishing his speech patterns to match his elevated social status. Hayes positioned himself near the windows, his trained eye automatically noting the security cameras positioned throughout the office and the subtle but unmistakable bulge beneath Walsh's left armpit that suggested a concealed weapon. The detective's decades of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of guilt and deception, and Walsh's body language screamed of someone who had spent 20 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for consequences that had finally arrived to collect their due. Walsh settled into his leather chair with the kind of theatrical sigh that suggested he was granting them an audience despite his incredibly busy schedule. He launched into an elaborate performance of grief and confusion, his voice taking on tones of wounded innocence as he recounted the terrible weeks following Frank and Helen's disappearance. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a loyal friend and business partner who had been forced to assume leadership of Jenkins Family Transport to prevent the company from collapsing completely. The lies flowed from Walsh's lips with practiced ease, each fabrication building upon the previous deception to create an elaborate structure of false narrative. He described Frank's supposed gambling addiction with convincing detail, complete with invented anecdotes about late-night poker games and debts to dangerous individuals who operated outside the boundaries of legal collection procedures. Helen, according to Walsh's carefully constructed fiction, had been dragged into her husband's self-destructive spiral, forced to participate in increasingly desperate schemes to generate cash for Frank's gaming habit. Clara felt nausea rising in her throat as Walsh continued his performance, each word another violation of her parents' memory and legacy. She watched his soft hands gesture expansively as he described the fictional version of Frank and Helen Jenkins, these weak-willed people who bore no resemblance to the principled individuals who had raised her with such love and dedication. Walsh's office felt like a mausoleum built from the bones of her family, every expensive decoration purchased with blood money that had originated with her parents' murder. Hayes listened with the patience of a predator, allowing Walsh to dig his own grave with increasingly elaborate lies that would eventually contradict the physical evidence and witness testimony that the detective had been methodically accumulating. Experienced investigators understood that guilty people could rarely resist the temptation to over-explain their innocence, and Walsh was providing enough rope to hang himself several times over, with his unnecessarily detailed account of events that supposedly occurred 20 years in the past. After 40 minutes of Walsh's theatrical performance, Clara excused herself to visit the restroom, needing distance from the suffocating atmosphere of lies and false sympathy that permeated his office. But instead of seeking relief in the ladies' room, she found herself drawn toward the freight elevators at the building's opposite end, following instincts that she could not logically explain, but felt compelled to trust. The service elevator descended to the building's basement level, where the mechanical systems hummed with constant energy and the air smelled of motor oil and industrial cleaning solvents. The basement storage area stretched across the building's entire footprint, filled with filing cabinets, outdated office equipment, and miscellaneous items that had accumulated over 2 decades of corporate expansion. Clara moved through the maze of stored materials with purposeful determination, guided by an inexplicable certainty that something important waited to be discovered in this forgotten corner of Walsh's empire. Her fingers traced the edges of dust-covered boxes and abandoned furniture, searching for she knew not what, but trusting that she would recognize it when she found it. In the storage area's farthest corner, partially concealed behind a stack of obsolete computer monitors, Clara discovered a section of the original Jenkins Family Transport office that had been preserved like a shrine to Walsh's humble beginnings. Frank's original desk sat covered with a protective tarp, its surface still bearing the coffee stains and pen marks that had accumulated during years of honest labor. Helen's filing system remained intact, though most of the files had been transferred to modern digital storage, and Clara could still smell traces of her mother's favorite lavender perfume clinging to the wooden drawers. But the most significant discovery waited in a corner where someone had carefully stored the personal effects recovered from the Peterbilt after its emergence from the quarry. Clara's hands trembled as she examined her parents' belongings, items that had been submerged for 20 years, but had been preserved by the oxygen-free environment at the bottom of the water-filled quarry. Helen's purse, still containing her wallet with photographs of 7-year-old Clara, sat beside Frank's thermos and the small leather journal he had used to record his thoughts during long highway vigils. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she discovered something that the initial investigation had missed. a hidden compartment built into the Peterbilt's dashboard, its presence concealed by metal panels that had been designed to appear decorative rather than functional. The compartment had been sealed with waterproof gaskets that had protected its contents from the quarry's destructive environment, preserving documents and personal items that Frank and Helen had clearly considered too dangerous to store in conventional locations. Inside the secret compartment, Clara found Helen's logbook, a leather-bound notebook filled with her mother's distinctive handwriting that brought tears to Clara's eyes as memories of childhood notes and letters came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. Helen's penmanship had always been precise and elegant, each letter formed with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything she touched, and seeing those familiar curves and loops preserved after 20 years felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. The logbook's early entries documented routine transportation business, pickup and delivery schedules written in Helen's methodical style, with occasional personal observations about interesting sights encountered during their travels. But as Clara read deeper into the journal, the tone shifted dramatically, Helen's words becoming increasingly concerned and frightened as she documented discoveries that had clearly shaken her faith in their business partnership with Walsh. Helen had begun to notice irregularities in their cargo manifests, shipments that arrived at their facility without corresponding paperwork, and containers that were loaded onto their trucks with instructions to avoid certain way stations and inspection points along their designated routes. The handwriting revealed Helen's growing unease as she realized that Jenkins Family Transport was being used to move materials that their legitimate clients had never contracted them to deliver. The name Leland Bishop appeared with increasing frequency in Helen's later entries, described as a well-dressed man with cold eyes who visited their facility during evening hours when most legitimate businesses were closed. Helen had documented Bishop's meetings with Walsh, conversations conducted in whispers behind closed doors, from which Walsh would emerge looking pale and frightened, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the nervous energy of a man trapped in circumstances beyond his control. Helen's final entries, written during the weeks immediately preceding their disappearance, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost them their lives. She had discovered that Bishop was using their transportation network to move cocaine shipments from Mexico to distribution points throughout the American Southwest, with Walsh serving as an unwilling but complicit participant who had been coerced into cooperation through threats against his family's safety. But the most heartbreaking revelation came in Helen's last entry, dated October 17, 1992, just hours before their final departure for Utah. She had written about her and Frank's decision to confront Walsh about the illegal operations, their plan to demand an immediate end to their involvement in Bishop's smuggling network, regardless of the financial consequences or personal danger that such defiance might bring. Helen's words revealed parents who understood that they were risking their lives, but refused to compromise their principles or leave their daughter a legacy built on criminal foundations. Clara read her mother's final written words through tears that blurred the elegant handwriting into watercolor smears across the yellowed pages. Helen had concluded her logbook with a prayer for Clara's future happiness, and a promise that she and Frank would find a way to extract themselves from Bishop's web of corruption without endangering their family's safety or compromising the values that had guided their lives together. The entry ended abruptly, incomplete, as if Helen had been interrupted while writing and had never found another opportunity to return to her journal. Clara clutched the logbook against her chest as the full weight of understanding crashed over her consciousness like a physical blow. Her parents had not been weak people who had succumbed to gambling addiction or financial desperation. They had been heroes who had chosen death over dishonor, murder over moral compromise, leaving behind a daughter they loved more than their own lives, rather than teaching her that integrity was negotiable and that principles could be abandoned when circumstances became difficult. The rage that filled Clara's heart was pure and righteous, burning away 20 years of misdirected anger and replacing it with fury aimed at the true villains in her family's tragedy. Walsh had not simply inherited a business. He had orchestrated a murder to eliminate the moral obstacles that prevented him from accepting Bishop's lucrative but deadly contracts. Every dollar of his current wealth, every symbol of his material success, had been purchased with her parents' blood and built upon the foundation of their graves. The elevator ride back to Walsh's office felt different this time, charged with an electric tension that made the air itself seem dense and oppressive. Clara clutched Helen's logbook against her chest like a shield, its leather binding warm from her body heat and damp from her perspiration. Detective Hayes stood beside her in the cramped elevator space, his weathered face set in the kind of grim determination that had sustained him through 4 decades of confronting human evil in all its varied forms. The building's fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a frequency that seemed to match Clara's racing heartbeat as the elevator climbed toward what she knew would be the most important confrontation of her life. Walsh's office looked different when they returned, the expensive furnishings and corporate symbols of success now appearing as nothing more than elaborate stage props designed to conceal the rotting foundation beneath his carefully constructed persona. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows at a sharper angle, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs and highlighting dust motes that danced in the golden light, like microscopic witnesses to the drama about to unfold. Walsh himself seemed diminished somehow, his earlier confidence replaced by the nervous energy of a man who sensed that his world was about to collapse around him. His soft hands fidgeted with a crystal paperweight on his desk, turning it over and over in movements that betrayed the anxiety he was struggling to conceal behind his practiced corporate smile. Beads of perspiration had begun to form along his hairline despite the office's perfectly controlled climate, and his pale blue eyes darted repeatedly toward the door as if calculating the distance required for an impossible escape. Clara placed Helen's logbook on Walsh's mahogany desk with deliberate ceremony, the soft leather binding making a whisper of sound against the polished wood surface. The journal seemed to radiate accusation in the suddenly silent office, its very presence transforming the atmosphere from one of polite interrogation to that of a formal tribunal where judgment was about to be rendered. Walsh's gaze fixed on the familiar object with the horrified recognition of a man seeing his own death warrant, his face draining of color until his complexion matched the stark white of his expensive shirt. The pages of Helen's journal fell open to reveal her distinctive handwriting, each carefully formed letter, a testament to the methodical nature that had characterized everything she touched during her abbreviated life. Clara watched Walsh's eyes scan the visible text, noting how his breathing became shallow and rapid as he absorbed the implications of her mother's preserved words. The crystal paperweight slipped from his trembling fingers and rolled across the desk's surface, coming to rest against a photograph of Walsh's own family that sat in a silver frame beside his computer monitor. Hayes positioned himself between Walsh and the office door, his movement casual but strategic, cutting off any possibility of flight, while maintaining the professional demeanor that had made him such an effective interrogator throughout his career. The detective's pale blue eyes never left Walsh's face as he documented every micro-expression, every telltale sign of guilt and fear that painted themselves across the businessman's increasingly haggard features. Walsh's confession began as a trickle of barely audible words, his voice cracking with the strain of carrying 20 years of accumulated guilt and terror. His soft hands shook as he reached for the crystal decanter on his sidebar, pouring himself 3 fingers of expensive bourbon that he consumed in a single desperate swallow, before beginning the narrative that would finally reveal the truth about Frank and Helen Jenkins's final hours. The story that emerged was one of weakness rather than malice, cowardice rather than calculated evil, though the distinction provided little comfort to Clara as she listened to the details of her parents' betrayal and murder. Walsh described himself as a victim of circumstances, a fundamentally decent man who had been trapped by forces beyond his control and coerced into participating in events that haunted his every waking moment for 2 decades. The gambling addiction had been real, Walsh admitted, though not Frank's as he had claimed during their earlier meeting. Walsh himself had been drawn into high-stakes poker games that operated in the shadow world of illegal gambling, seduced by the thrill of risk and the intoxicating possibility of easy money that could solve all his financial problems with a single fortunate hand. But fortune had proven cruelly elusive, and Walsh's modest savings had evaporated with shocking speed, replaced by debts that grew larger and more dangerous with each passing week. Leland Bishop had materialized in Walsh's life like a well-dressed demon, arriving at the poker table with stacks of cash and the kind of predatory smile that suggested he fed on other people's desperation. Bishop was a man who understood leverage in all its forms, who could identify weakness with the precision of a surgeon and exploit it with the ruthless efficiency of a machine designed for destruction. When Walsh's debts reached a point where conventional collection methods would have been insufficient, Bishop had offered an alternative arrangement that seemed like salvation, but was actually a doorway to damnation. The proposal had been elegant in its simplicity. Walsh would provide Bishop with access to Jenkins Family Transport's shipping network, allowing carefully selected cargo to move through the legitimate transportation system without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. In exchange, Walsh's gambling debts would be forgiven, and he would receive a percentage of the profits generated by Bishop's illicit operations. The arrangement seemed almost victimless, a small compromise that would solve Walsh's immediate problems while harming no one except the faceless government agencies that would be denied their drug seizure statistics. But Frank and Helen Jenkins had possessed the kind of moral clarity that made such compromises impossible. They had built their transportation company on a foundation of honesty and integrity, taking pride in their reputation for reliable service and ethical business practices. When they began to notice irregularities in their shipping manifests and questioned the nature of certain high-paying contracts that required unusual secrecy and routing procedures, their investigation had threatened to expose Bishop's entire operation. Walsh's voice broke as he described the meeting where Bishop had presented him with an ultimatum that offered no acceptable choices. Frank and Helen's growing suspicions had made them a liability that could no longer be tolerated, and Bishop had made it clear that their continued existence represented a threat to everyone involved in the smuggling operation. Walsh could cooperate in eliminating this threat, or he could watch his own family suffer the consequences of his defiance. The photographs Bishop had shown Walsh during that terrible meeting were burned into his memory with the clarity of fresh wounds, images of Walsh's wife and children taken with telephoto lenses from distances that demonstrated how easily Bishop's people could reach them at any time. The message was unmistakable. Frank and Helen Jenkins would die regardless of Walsh's decision, but his family's survival depended entirely on his willingness to facilitate their murder. Walsh's participation in the actual killing had been limited but crucial. On the night of October 18, 1992, he had contacted Frank and Helen with an urgent request for a private meeting at the old Riverside quarry, claiming that he had discovered the identity of the person responsible for the illegal activities that had contaminated their business partnership. He had presented the meeting as an opportunity to confront their tormentor and demand an end to the corruption that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Frank and Helen had arrived at the quarry with the kind of trust that Walsh would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Their faith in their business partner absolute, despite the circumstances that had brought them to that isolated location. They had parked their Peterbilt near the quarry's edge, the truck's headlights cutting through the October darkness to illuminate the meeting site where they expected to find answers and resolution to the nightmare that had been consuming their lives for months. Bishop had been waiting in the shadows with two associates, whose faces Walsh had never seen clearly, and whose names he had never learned. The confrontation had been brief and efficient, conducted with the kind of professional brutality that suggested extensive experience with such matters. Frank had been shot execution style while attempting to shield Helen from harm, the bullet entering behind his left ear and killing him instantly. Helen's death had followed within seconds, a single knife thrust to the heart delivered with surgical precision that ended her life before she could fully comprehend what was happening. Walsh had watched from his concealed position among the quarry's machinery, paralyzed by horror and self-loathing as Bishop's men loaded the bodies back into the Peterbilt and drove the truck to the quarry's deepest point. The vehicle had disappeared beneath the dark water with barely a splash, carrying Frank and Helen Jenkins to their underwater grave where they would remain hidden for 20 years while their killer rebuilt his life on the foundation of their murder. The confession continued for nearly an hour, Walsh's voice growing hoarser and more broken with each revealed detail, each admission of complicity in the destruction of a family that had trusted him completely. He described the years that followed, the gradual expansion of his business empire built on blood money and sustained by his continued cooperation with Bishop's criminal organization. Every success had been poisoned by the knowledge of how it had been achieved. Every moment of prosperity shadowed by the memory of Frank and Helen's final moments. Clara listened to Walsh's confession with a mixture of rage and revulsion that left her feeling physically ill. Her hands clenched into fists so tight that her fingernails drew blood from her palms. The man sitting across from her had stolen everything meaningful from her life, had robbed her of 20 years with parents who had loved her enough to die rather than compromise their principles. Walsh's tears and expressions of remorse felt like additional violations, attempts to claim victim status when he had been an willing participant in the most heinous betrayal imaginable. But beneath her fury, Clara felt something else beginning to emerge. a profound sense of awe and gratitude for the parents she was finally beginning to understand completely. Frank and Helen Jenkins had faced an impossible choice between their principles and their lives, between their integrity and their survival, and they had chosen death over dishonor without hesitation. They had died as they had lived, together and united in their commitment to the values that defined them as human beings. The weight of 20 years of misdirected anger began to lift from Clara's shoulders, replaced by a grief that was pure and clean, and somehow healing in its intensity. She had spent 2 decades mourning her abandonment when she should have been celebrating her parents' sacrifice, hating them for weakness when she should have been honoring their strength. Frank and Helen Jenkins had not left her by choice. They had been taken from her by evil men who could not tolerate the existence of people who refused to be corrupted or compromised. Hayes had remained silent throughout Walsh's confession, his experienced eye cataloging every detail that would be crucial for the prosecution that would follow. The detective understood that Clara needed to hear the complete truth, no matter how painful, in order to finally put her parents' memory to rest with the honor and dignity they deserved. Justice had been delayed for 20 years, but it would not be denied entirely, and those responsible for Frank and Helen's murder would finally face the consequences of their actions. The Bishop Tower pierced the city's skyline like a gleaming spear thrust upward from the urban landscape, its 42 stories of steel and glass reflecting the late afternoon sun in patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Clara stood on the sidewalk across the street, her neck craned back as she studied the monument to greed and corruption that housed the man responsible for destroying her family. Each window caught the light like a watching eye, and she could almost feel the building's oppressive presence pressing down upon her shoulders as she prepared to enter the domain of her parents' killer. Detective Hayes positioned himself beside Clara, his weathered hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder, as they observed the steady stream of well-dressed professionals flowing in and out of the building's marble-clad entrance. Security guards in expensive suits monitored the lobby through floor-to-ceiling windows, their alert postures and earpiece communication devices suggesting military or law enforcement backgrounds. Everything about the Bishop Tower projected power and intimidation, from the bronze sculptures flanking the entrance to the uniformed doorman who screened visitors with the scrutiny of a border guard protecting hostile territory. The research Hayes had conducted during the past 48 hours painted Leland Bishop as a master of reinvention, a criminal who had successfully transformed himself into a pillar of the community through carefully orchestrated philanthropy and strategic political contributions. Bishop's real estate empire sprawled across 7 states, encompassing shopping centers, office complexes, and luxury residential developments that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. His photograph appeared regularly in society pages and business journals, always showing a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and expensive suits, who radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having faced meaningful consequences for his actions. But beneath the veneer of respectability, Hayes had uncovered a pattern of suspicious activities that stretched back decades. Properties owned by Bishop's various shell companies had been linked to money laundering operations, drug distribution networks, and human trafficking rings that operated with virtual impunity due to his political connections and financial influence. Law enforcement agencies had attempted to investigate Bishop's activities multiple times, but their efforts had consistently been thwarted by legal challenges, intimidation tactics, and the mysterious disappearance of key witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the hidden recording device that Hayes had provided, a sophisticated piece of technology that would capture every word of the confrontation she was about to initiate. The device was virtually undetectable, designed to look like an ordinary pen that would draw no attention from Bishop's security personnel. Hayes had insisted on the precaution, understanding that any confession they obtained would need to be documented with irrefutable clarity if they hoped to finally bring Bishop to justice after decades of impunity. The lobby of the Bishop Tower was a cathedral of capitalism, its soaring ceiling supported by marble columns that had been imported from Italian quarries at astronomical expense. The floor was a mosaic of precious stones arranged in geometric patterns that caught the light from crystal chandeliers suspended overhead like frozen fireworks. Every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that required constant maintenance, and the air was perfumed with subtle fragrances designed to create an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity. Clara's heels clicked against the marble floor with staccato precision as she approached the reception desk, where a young woman with perfect makeup and an even more perfect smile, inquired about the nature of her visit. The receptionist's polished professionalism faltered slightly when Clara identified herself as the daughter of Frank and Helen Jenkins, and Clara noted how the woman's eyes darted nervously toward a security camera before she reached for the telephone to announce the unexpected visitor to her employer. The elevator that carried Clara to the building's top floor was a work of art in itself, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected her image into infinity, while soft classical music played from hidden speakers. She watched herself multiply endlessly in the reflective surfaces, each iteration showing a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. The elevator's ascent felt both eternal and instantaneous, carrying her toward a confrontation that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her entire adult life. Bishop's executive suite occupied the entire top floor of his tower, a sprawling domain that commanded panoramic views of the city below. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space like a transparent barrier between Bishop and the world he sought to dominate, offering vistas that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The office was decorated with museum-quality artwork and antique furniture that represented centuries of human craftsmanship, each piece carefully selected to project an image of cultivation and refinement that masked the brutality of its owner's true nature. Leland Bishop himself stood silhouetted against the western windows, his tall frame backlit by the golden light of the setting sun that painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. At 71 years old, he carried himself with the erect posture of a military officer, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his charcoal suit tailored with mathematical precision. When he turned to face Clara, his pale gray eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had never learned to fear his prey, and his smile revealed teeth that were too white and too perfect to be entirely natural. Bishop's office was arranged like a throne room, with his massive desk positioned to command the space, while leather chairs for visitors were placed at calculated distances to emphasize his dominance over anyone who sought an audience with him. Persian rugs covered portions of the hardwood floor in intricate patterns that probably represented more wealth than most families would see in a lifetime, and crystal decanters filled with expensive liquors sat on marble-topped tables that gleamed like altars to material excess. The walls were lined with framed photographs documenting Bishop's rise to power and influence, images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity galas, and meetings with politicians whose careers had been funded by his strategic contributions. But Clara's trained eye noticed other details that revealed the true nature of Bishop's empire. Security monitors that provided views of the building's entrance and loading docks, a safe built into the wall behind his desk, and communication equipment that suggested coordination with operations that required absolute secrecy. Bishop moved with the fluid grace of a man who had never doubted his ability to control any situation through a combination of wealth, intimidation, and ruthless calculation. He gestured toward one of the leather chairs with theatrical courtesy, his movements precise and economical in the way of someone who understood that every gesture carried significance and projected meaning to those observing him. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of expensive education and careful elocution training, though Clara detected traces of cruder origins that he had never completely eliminated. The conversation began with elaborate expressions of sympathy and condolence, Bishop's performance carefully calibrated to project the image of a successful businessman who was genuinely saddened by the tragic fate of the Jenkins family. He spoke of Frank and Helen with apparent respect and admiration, describing them as honest people who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their control and had paid an unfortunate price for their involvement with dangerous individuals who operated outside the boundaries of civilized society. But as Clara pressed for more specific details about his knowledge of her parents' business operations, Bishop's mask began to slip with subtle but unmistakable signs. His pale gray eyes took on a calculating quality that reminded Clara of a snake preparing to strike, and his smile acquired an edge of cruelty that suggested he was beginning to enjoy the psychological game they were playing. When Clara mentioned Walsh's confession and the evidence contained in Helen's logbook, Bishop's reaction was not surprise or denial, but rather amusement at her naivety in believing that such revelations could threaten someone of his stature and influence. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, Bishop's veneer of respectability peeling away like old paint to reveal the predator beneath. He began to speak more candidly about his business operations, describing them with the pride of an artist discussing his masterpieces. The transportation network he had constructed using companies like Jenkins Family Transport was, in his view, a work of genius that had moved hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine through the American heartland without attracting significant attention from law enforcement agencies. Bishop's confession unfolded with chilling matter-of-factness, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of a professor explaining complex concepts to a particularly slow student. He described Frank and Helen Jenkins as obstacles that had threatened to disrupt a carefully balanced system. Naive idealists who had lacked the sophistication to understand the realities of modern commerce. Their moral objections to his operations had been, in Bishop's view, both predictable and ultimately irrelevant, since people with such rigid principles were inevitably crushed by forces too powerful for their limited understanding to comprehend. The details of their murder emerged with surgical precision, Bishop's account revealing a mind that approached violence with the same methodical planning he applied to real estate development and political manipulation. He had identified Walsh as the weak link in the Jenkins operation months before the actual killing, spending considerable time and resources to cultivate the gambling addiction that would eventually provide the leverage necessary to ensure his cooperation. The elimination of Frank and Helen had been planned with the thoroughness of a military campaign, every contingency considered, and every potential complication addressed through careful preparation and strategic thinking. Bishop's description of the actual murders was delivered with the emotional detachment of a surgeon discussing a routine procedure, his voice betraying no trace of remorse or regret for the lives he had destroyed. He spoke of Frank and Helen's final moments with scientific curiosity rather than human compassion, analyzing their reactions and responses as data points that might prove useful for future operations of similar nature. The efficiency of their deaths was, in Bishop's estimation, a mark of professional competence rather than a source of moral concern. Clara felt nausea rising in her throat as Bishop continued his casual recounting of her parents' murder, each detail another violation of their memory and dignity. But beneath her revulsion, she felt a cold satisfaction as she realized that Bishop's arrogance was providing exactly the kind of detailed confession that would finally bring him to justice. The recording device continued its silent documentation of every word, capturing evidence that would seal Bishop's fate as surely as he had sealed her parents 20 years earlier. Bishop's monologue reached its climax as he described the disposal of Frank and Helen's bodies with the same attention to detail he might have devoted to describing a successful real estate transaction. The quarry had been selected for its isolation and depth, characteristics that would ensure the Peterbilt and its contents remained hidden until the natural processes of time and decay eliminated any trace of the evidence linking him to their disappearance. The plan had worked perfectly for 2 decades, and Bishop seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would question the efficiency of a system that had operated without detection for so long. The final revelation came as Bishop expressed his genuine bewilderment at Frank and Helen's decision to resist his offers of financial compensation for their cooperation. In his worldview, every person had a price, and their refusal to be corrupted represented a failure of imagination rather than strength of character. He described their deaths as unnecessary tragedies that could have been avoided if they had simply accepted the reality that moral principles were luxuries that practical people could not afford in the modern world. The phone call came at 3:17 in the morning, jolting Clara from the first peaceful sleep she had experienced in weeks. Detective Hayes's gravelly voice carried urgency that cut through her drowsiness like cold water, informing her that Bishop's private security team had been spotted outside Walsh's residence, and that their key witness had vanished without a trace. The implications crashed over Clara with terrifying clarity. Bishop knew about their investigation, and was systematically eliminating everyone who could testify against him. Clara dressed in the dark, her hands trembling as she pulled on clothes that felt like armor for the battle ahead. The city outside her apartment windows was wrapped in the deep silence of pre-dawn hours, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional wail of emergency sirens that seemed to echo the chaos consuming her life. She grabbed her father's old leather jacket from the closet, a relic she had preserved since childhood, drawing comfort from the familiar scent of motor oil and honest work that still clung to its weathered surface. Hayes was waiting in his unmarked sedan outside her building, the engine running and exhaust visible in the cool morning air like dragon's breath. The detective's face showed the strain of too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. Deep lines etched around his pale blue eyes that spoke of 4 decades spent wrestling with human darkness. As Clara slid into the passenger seat, she noticed the service weapon holstered beneath his jacket and the tactical vest he wore under his shirt. Equipment that transformed their investigation from intellectual exercise into mortal combat. The drive to Walsh's suburban home took them through neighborhoods that were gradually awakening to another ordinary day, their residents blissfully unaware of the life-and-death struggle being waged in their midst. Newspaper delivery trucks rumbled through intersection while joggers emerged for their morning exercise routines, their normalcy creating a surreal contrast to the danger that stalked Clara and Hayes through the pre-dawn darkness. The radio crackled occasionally with police dispatch calls, routine reports of domestic disturbances and traffic accidents that represented the mundane crimes of a civilized society. Walsh's house stood dark and silent in its manicured subdivision, the windows reflecting the streetlights like dead eyes staring into the night. Yellow police tape fluttered from the front porch railings, and chalk outlines on the driveway told the story of violence that had visited this peaceful neighborhood, while its residents slept soundly in their beds. The forensics team had already completed their work, leaving behind only the ghostly traces of their investigation and the lingering scent of chemicals used to process evidence. Hayes led Clara around the house's perimeter, his flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed to harbor threats in every darkened corner. The detective's trained eye cataloged the signs of professional execution, the disabled security system, the precisely cut window screen that had provided silent entry, and the absence of defensive wounds on Walsh's body that suggested he had been killed before he could react to the danger. This was not the work of desperate amateurs, but rather the calculated elimination of a liability by people who understood violence as a business tool. Inside the house, the destruction was methodical and thorough. Every drawer emptied, every closet searched, every potential hiding place examined with surgical precision. Bishop's people had been looking for something specific, and the systematic nature of their search suggested they had found what they sought. Family photographs lay scattered across the hardwood floors, their glass frames shattered into sharp fragments that crunched beneath Clara's feet as she moved through rooms that had once sheltered Walsh's children and grandchildren. The discovery that changed everything came in Walsh's basement workshop, hidden behind a false wall that had been constructed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested paranoid foresight. Hayes found the concealed space by accident, his flashlight beam catching the subtle difference in paint color that marked the hidden panel's edges. Behind the wall lay a sophisticated recording studio, complete with professional-grade audio equipment and racks of magnetic tapes labeled with dates stretching back over 20 years. Walsh had been documenting his conversations with Bishop and his associates for decades, apparently understanding that his survival might someday depend on his ability to prove his status as unwilling participant rather than willing conspirator. The tapes were organized with obsessive precision, each reel carefully labeled with dates, times, and participant names that read like a directory of organized crime in the region. But the most significant discovery waited on a shelf marked with the dates from October 1992, tapes that contained the final conversations leading up to Frank and Helen's murder. Clara's hands shook as she held the reel labeled October 18, 1992, Final Meeting. Understanding that she was about to hear her parents' voices for the first time in 20 years, Hayes set up the playback equipment with reverent care, his weathered fingers adjusting controls with the precision of someone who understood the sacred nature of the evidence they were about to witness. The magnetic tape began its slow journey from reel to reel, and the basement workshop filled with voices from the grave, preserved by Walsh's paranoia and delivered by time's cruel justice. The first voice to emerge from the speakers was Bishop's, instantly recognizable from Clara's recent confrontation, but younger and more openly menacing than the polished facade he had presented in his tower office. His words carried the casual brutality of someone accustomed to solving problems through violence, describing Frank and Helen Jenkins as obstacles that needed to be removed with the same emotional detachment he might have used to discuss terminating a business contract. The recording captured every nuance of his psychopathy, from the slight amusement in his voice when discussing murder to the cold calculation he applied to planning the disposal of their bodies. Walsh's voice provided a counterpoint of fear and desperate rationalization, his words tumbling over each other as he attempted to negotiate alternatives that might spare his former partners while still satisfying Bishop's demands. The terror in his voice was palpable, a man trapped between his conscience and his survival instincts, ultimately choosing self-preservation over loyalty. His protests grew weaker as Bishop's threats became more explicit, until finally Walsh agreed to lure Frank and Helen to the quarry under false pretenses. But it was the sound of her father's voice that shattered Clara's carefully maintained composure. Frank's familiar baritone emerging from the speakers, with the calm authority she remembered from childhood bedtime stories and morning conversations over pancakes. Even facing death, Frank Jenkins spoke with quiet dignity. His words measured and thoughtful, as he attempted to reason with men who had abandoned reason for greed. He addressed Bishop directly, acknowledging the businessman's power while refusing to be intimidated by threats against his family or livelihood. Helen's voice joined the conversation with the gentle strength that had anchored their family through 15 years of marriage and partnership. She spoke with the moral clarity of someone who had never compromised her principles, addressing Bishop's offers of financial compensation with polite but absolute refusal. Her words revealed parents who understood the stakes of their defiance, but chose death over dishonor, sacrifice over survival, leaving their daughter a legacy of integrity rather than wealth built on criminal foundations. The recording captured the escalating tension as Bishop's patience evaporated, and his true nature emerged with increasing clarity. His voice took on the predatory edge that Clara had witnessed during their confrontation. But here it was, unfiltered by the need to maintain appearances or project respectability. He described in precise detail what would happen to Clara if her parents continued their resistance, painting scenarios of violence and degradation that were designed to break their resolve through sheer terror. Frank's response to these threats revealed the man Clara was finally beginning to understand completely. A father whose love for his daughter transcended his own survival instincts, but who refused to purchase her safety through moral compromise. His voice remained steady as he explained that teaching Clara that principles could be abandoned when circumstances became difficult would be a greater tragedy than orphaning her through adherence to those same principles. He and Helen would rather die as people worthy of her respect than live as examples of cowardice and corruption. The final minutes of the recording documented the confrontation at the quarry with horrifying clarity. Walsh's voice providing nervous narration as Bishop's associates positioned Frank and Helen near the water's edge. The couple's last words were directed toward each other rather than their killers, quiet expressions of love and mutual support that demonstrated their unbreakable bond even in the face of imminent death. Helen whispered her regrets about leaving Clara orphaned, but expressed her certainty that their daughter would understand someday that some principles were worth dying for. Frank's final statement was directed toward the recording device Walsh was secretly operating, apparently understanding that their deaths needed to be documented if justice was ever to be served. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he declared that he and Helen died as they had lived, together and uncompromised, leaving behind a daughter who would someday learn that her parents had chosen death over dishonor. The sound of the gunshot that ended his life reverberated through the basement workshop like a physical blow, followed by Helen's brief cry of anguish before the second shot silenced her forever. Clara collapsed to her knees on the concrete floor, her body racked with sobs that seemed to originate from some deep well of grief she had never known existed. The voices of her parents, preserved by magnetic tape and delivered across 20 years of separation, had given her the gift she had never dared hope to receive. The knowledge that they had loved her enough to die for the principles that would make her worthy of their sacrifice. The anger and abandonment that had poisoned 2 decades of her life evaporated like morning mist, replaced by profound gratitude for parents who had taught her through their deaths what it meant to live with genuine integrity. Hayes knelt beside Clara, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder as she processed the emotional earthquake that was reshaping her understanding of her family's history. The detective had witnessed countless scenes of grief and revelation during his career, but few had moved him as deeply as watching Clara finally receive the truth about her parents' love and sacrifice. The recording provided not only the evidence necessary to prosecute Bishop, but also the emotional closure that would allow Clara to honor her parents' memory with the dignity they deserved. But their moment of revelation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs, heavy boots that suggested multiple intruders moving with military precision through the house above. Hayes drew his service weapon with fluid motion, his pale blue eyes scanning the workshop for defensive positions, while his mind calculated angles of fire and escape routes. Bishop had discovered their location, and his cleanup crew was arriving to eliminate the final witnesses to his decades of criminal activity. Clara wiped her tears with determined resolve, understanding that the battle for justice was entering its final phase. Her parents had faced death with courage and dignity, refusing to compromise their principles even when confronted with overwhelming force. She would honor their sacrifice by completing the fight they had begun, ensuring that their killer finally faced the consequences of his actions. The recording in her hands represented more than evidence. It was her parents' final gift, their voices reaching across 20 years of separation to give her the strength necessary to see justice done. The dawn that broke over the city 18 months later carried a different quality of light than Clara had ever noticed before. Softer somehow, and touched with the golden promise of redemption finally achieved. She stood at her apartment window, watching the sun paint the downtown skyline in shades of amber and rose, while the morning news played softly from the television behind her. The lead story featured footage of Leland Bishop being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled from a night spent in county jail, the first of many he would spend behind bars during his natural life sentence. The trial had lasted 4 months, transforming the city's courthouse into a theater where 20 years of buried truth finally received its moment in the spotlight. Clara had testified for 6 hours, her voice steady and clear as she walked the jury through her parents' final weeks, using Helen's logbook and Walsh's recordings to paint a portrait of 2 people who had chosen death over compromise. The courtroom had fallen completely silent when Frank and Helen's voices emerged from the audio system, their final words creating a moment of profound reverence that even Bishop's expensive defense attorneys could not diminish through legal objections or procedural challenges. Bishop himself had remained impassive throughout most of the proceedings, his pale gray eyes showing no trace of remorse or regret, as witness after witness detailed his crimes and their consequences. But Clara had noticed the moment when his composure finally cracked, a brief flicker of genuine emotion crossing his face when the medical examiner testified about Helen's final moments and the angle of the knife wound that had pierced her heart. For just an instant, Bishop had looked like what he truly was. An aging man who had spent his life destroying other people's happiness and was finally facing the consequences of his choices. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts, including 2 charges of first-degree murder that carried mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole. When the foreman read the verdict, Clara had felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without its oppressive presence. Justice had moved slowly, but it had moved inevitably toward the truth that Frank and Helen Jenkins had died protecting. Robert Walsh's fate had been determined months earlier through a plea agreement that exchanged his cooperation for a reduced sentence of 25 years in federal prison. His testimony had provided crucial details about Bishop's criminal organization and the network of corruption that had protected it for decades. But Walsh's punishment extended far beyond his legal sentence. His family name had become synonymous with betrayal and cowardice, his children and grandchildren forced to carry the burden of his choices for the rest of their lives. The media attention surrounding the trial had transformed Frank and Helen Jenkins from forgotten footnotes in an unsolved case into symbols of integrity and moral courage that captured the public imagination. Documentary filmmakers had requested interviews, journalists had written feature articles about their sacrifice, and a scholarship fund established in their memory had already provided college education for dozens of deserving students. The trucking industry had honored them posthumously, recognizing Frank and Helen as examples of the ethical standards that defined honest transportation professionals. But for Clara, the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had reopened 17 other cold cases linked to Bishop's criminal network, including the disappearances of 3 other families who had apparently posed similar threats to his operations. Frank and Helen's courage in documenting their suspicions had provided the key that unlocked decades of unsolved mysteries, bringing closure to families who had spent years wondering about the fate of missing loved ones. The restoration of the Peterbilt had been Clara's personal project, a labor of love that had consumed her evenings and weekends for the better part of a year. She had learned the names of every component, had worked alongside mechanics who remembered her father's reputation for maintaining equipment with religious dedication. The truck's midnight blue paint gleamed like liquid starlight under the morning sun, and the chrome bumpers reflected her image with mirror-like perfection. The cab's interior had been returned to exactly the configuration Frank and Helen had preferred, down to the placement of Helen's small collection of romance novels and Frank's worn leather journal. Clara climbed into the driver's seat, her hands resting on the steering wheel that her father had gripped during thousands of miles of honest labor. The vinyl seats still carried the subtle impression of their bodies, and she could almost feel their presence surrounding her like a warm embrace. The dashboard held a new addition, a silver picture frame containing the last photograph taken of Frank and Helen together, their arms wrapped around each other beside their original truck, their faces radiating the quiet pride of people who had built something meaningful with their own hands. The engine turned over with a satisfying rumble that sent vibrations through the truck's frame and into Clara's bones, connecting her to the generations of drivers who had found freedom and purpose on America's highways. She adjusted the rearview mirror and caught sight of her own reflection, noting how her features had begun to show traces of her parents' faces, the genetic inheritance that linked her to their legacy of integrity and determination. The resemblance no longer filled her with the bitter resentment that had poisoned her youth. Instead, she felt honored to carry their physical characteristics as well as their moral principles into the future. The drive to the cemetery took her through neighborhoods that had featured prominently in the trial, past the former location of Bishop's first office building and the warehouse where he had laundered drug money through legitimate real estate transactions. The urban landscape looked different now that Clara understood the hidden networks of corruption that had operated beneath its respectable surface. But she also noticed signs of renewal and regeneration. New businesses opening in buildings that had once housed criminal enterprises, honest families moving into neighborhoods that had been cleaned up by the prosecutions that followed Bishop's downfall. The Riverside Cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the quarry where Frank and Helen's bodies had been discovered, a location that Clara had initially considered inappropriate, but had come to appreciate for its symbolic significance. Her parents' gravesite was marked by a simple granite headstone that bore their names, birth dates, and a brief inscription that captured the essence of their lives. Frank and Helen Jenkins, united in life, united in death, united in honor. Fresh flowers appeared at the gravesite weekly, left by truckers who had known Frank's reputation and community members who had been moved by their story. Clara knelt beside the headstone, placing her hand on the sun-warmed granite while she spoke silently to parents who had finally received the recognition and respect they deserved. The anger and abandonment that had defined her relationship with their memory had been replaced by profound gratitude for the example they had set and the principles they had died defending. She understood now that their greatest gift to her had not been the comfortable childhood they had provided, but rather the demonstration of what it meant to live with genuine integrity, even when such living demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The cemetery was quiet except for the gentle rustling of oak leaves overhead and the distant sound of traffic on the highway, where Frank and Helen had spent so many years earning their living through honest labor. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace, and Clara took it as a sign that her parents were finally at peace. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and their reputation had been restored to the honor they had never lost, but which the world had failed to recognize. Clara returned to the Peterbilt and opened Helen's journal to the final entry, reading her mother's words with eyes that no longer filled with tears, but with profound appreciation for the woman who had faced death with such dignity and grace. Helen's final prayer for Clara's happiness had been answered in ways that neither of them could have anticipated during those dark October days in 1992. Clara had found not only happiness but purpose, understanding that her parents' sacrifice had transformed her into someone capable of fighting for justice and truth with the same unwavering determination they had demonstrated. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Clara finally started the Peterbilt's engine and began the drive home. The truck responded to her touch like a living thing, its mechanical systems harmonizing in the symphony of internal combustion that had provided the soundtrack to her parents' working lives. She rolled down the windows to let the autumn air flow through the cab, carrying with it the sense of harvested fields and changing seasons that marked the eternal cycle of death and renewal. As Clara drove through the city streets, she noticed how the Peterbilt attracted attention from other drivers and pedestrians, many of whom recognized it from the news coverage and nodded respectfully as she passed. The truck had become more than transportation. It was a rolling memorial to integrity and courage, a mobile reminder that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost involved. Clara felt the weight of that responsibility settling comfortably on her shoulders, understanding that she was now the keeper of her parents' legacy and the guardian of their memory. The journey concluded at Clara's apartment building, where she carefully parked the Peterbilt in a space she had reserved specifically for its use. She sat for several minutes in the driver's seat, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk, while she processed the emotional transformation that had reshaped her understanding of family, loyalty, and love. The parents she had spent 20 years resenting for their supposed abandonment had actually died trying to protect her from a world of corruption and violence, choosing to leave her orphaned but honorable, rather than alive, but compromised. Clara locked the truck's doors and walked toward her apartment building, carrying with her a sense of peace and completion that had eluded her for most of her adult life. The investigation was closed, the criminals were imprisoned, and her parents' reputation had been restored to its rightful place in the pantheon of people who had chosen principle over profit. But most importantly, Clara had finally found the connection to Frank and Helen Jenkins that she had been seeking since childhood, understanding that their love for her had been so profound that they had been willing to die rather than teach her that integrity was negotiable. The apartment that welcomed her home felt different somehow, transformed from a refuge from painful memories into a sanctuary where she could honor her parents' legacy while building a future worthy of their sacrifice. Clara placed Helen's journal on the mantelpiece beside photographs that now represented joy rather than loss, understanding that she carried within herself the best qualities of both parents and the responsibility to use those qualities in service of justice and truth. Frank and Helen Jenkins lived on in their daughter's commitment to the principles they had died defending, their voices silenced, but their influence eternal in the woman they had raised with such love and dedication. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.